By the way, these are the same people who lied us into the Iraq war, lied to us
True.
about Libya, lied to us about Syria, dropped so many bombs in Syria they ran out of bombs. They're doing the same thing.
They're lying to everyone. And unfortunately, the Europeans are going to suffer this winter because of these lies, that their leaders are telling them the same lies that sent me to Iraq and other regions in the Middle East as well, where all my fellow Marines had to go fight in Afghanistan or whatever the case, and then the same lies against Assad. It's the same script, different actors. That's what we're seeing here.
To sell you Russia's invasion, Vatniks will bring up that the US government lied about Iraq and was wrong about other wars. Then they'll say that the US government is also lying about Ukraine, when in fact it's these Vatniks who are lying about Ukraine over and over again. It's easy for people to believe them because the US government and the left-wing establishment has lied to us so much recently about vaccines, white supremacy, January 6th being worse than 9/11. Because of how outrageous their lies are, a lot of people now think that they are lying on every issue and assume that Putin is not the aggressor in this conflict. Before, it was Fox News and the right-wing establishment that lied about Iraq, Afghanistan, and 9/11. Don't you think they're lying to you about Ukraine as well? Most people in Ukraine's eastern region speak Russian because of past Russification in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that the majority or vast majority of them are ethnically Russian, as Vatniks often claim. In order to sell you Putin's illegal annexations, Syrian Ho and others will lie and say that those regions are majority ethnically Russian. The data available doesn't support their claims. If those regions were actually majority ethnically Russian, then the total ethnic Russian population in Ukraine would be much higher than 17%. So in regards to the known 3,404 civilians killed in the war prior to 2022, most of them may not have been ethnically Russian as Kremlin propagandists make it out to be. A lot of ethnic Ukrainians died too. Also, Vatniks will call it a genocide and portray it as if Ukrainian forces killed all the civilians, but in a war like this prior to 2022, both sides share responsibility. After the first 2 years of the war, the amount of civilians killed were 112 in 2016, 117 in 2017, 58 in 2018, 27 in 2019, 26 in 2020, and 25 in 2021. Ukraine didn't make it illegal to speak Russian, and what was happening for 75% of the war, from 2016 to 2021, was not a genocide. Putin doesn't consider approximately 3.5 million Ukrainians starved to death by the Soviet Union to be a genocide, yet he considers 3,500 civilians killed in a war he started to be a genocide. If you hold both sides accountable for the civilian deaths, they've each killed around 12 to 13 civilians in 2021. Putin decided to invade Ukraine because they killed around 12 to 13 civilians in eastern Ukraine within 1 year. Then he kills 11 civilians in eastern Ukraine within 1 day. If killing 12 to 13 civilians in 1 year is genocide, isn't killing 11 civilians in 1 day genocide as well? Around 3,000 civilians were killed in the first 8 years of the war. Also, according to the UN, over 3,000 civilians were killed in the first 2 months of Putin's full-scale invasion. All over alt media, you'll hear that the Ukrainian forces are genocidal. But who's more reckless when it comes to shelling targets in residential areas, Ukraine or Russia?
Even Colonel Douglas Macgregor says that the operations of Russia in Ukraine have actually been significant in terms of military history due to the fact that there's been a huge effort and a successful effort by the Russians to minimize civilian casualties. Now, I know
we have fucking eyes, Jackson. We can see the war crimes every day. They're fucking shooting people every day. We see the bodies.
Yes,
we see
no,
the missile strikes on civilian infrastructure.
You're right.
We've got eyes.
You're right. Let me just finish my point. Then you can soy out again. So you're right. They're shooting every day. The Ukrainian air defenses are shooting their own apartment buildings every single day. You're right about that. So
shooting their own
wasn't done, Drew. Not done. So it may surprise you, but there's been far less civilians killed over the past year of what you're describing as the most intense extermination effort since, Hitler in World War II, than the amount of civilians who died over the fighting in the Donbass, the asymmetrical warfare led by Nazi Banderites and the Ukrainian military before these regions were incorporated into the Russian Federation. Far less civilians killed over the past year than we saw in the Donbass.
Jackson Hinkle has no shame. By the end of this video, you'll have no doubt that he is a pathological liar who regularly tells his audience the opposite of the truth. Kremlin propagandists and pro-Russian social media accounts covering the war will often claim that Ukraine was shelling Donbass for 8 years, so Putin had to step in to save the people. In 8 years of Ukraine trying to take back their territory, Donetsk doesn't look remotely close to this. This is Bakhmut after 1 year of Russia's full-scale invasion. The idea that Ukraine is recklessly shelling civilians and Russia is the one showing restraint is beyond stupid. Sadly, so many people online have become seriously deluded as this war has gone on, and they believe what the Vatniks are telling them.
It's kind of like saying, "Oh, the Comanches were just as bad." That's what that's what they mean when they say Hamas is just as bad. But Hamas is a reaction to the creation of a Jewish state. So I don't agree that Hamas can be seen as equal. I think people have a right to defend themselves, and their territory is being eroded.
I'm not against Palestinian resistance, but Syrian host supports Hamas firing rockets into Israel, and she doesn't blame Hamas for the civilian deaths. But when Ukrainian soldiers fire at invading Russian soldiers, she blames the Ukrainian soldiers for the civilian deaths and has the audacity to claim that they are using civilians as human shields. What did the Iraqis do when they were invaded by American soldiers? They shot at them from whatever building or house they were in. Then the American soldiers responded by leveling the entire area. Under Syrian Ho's own logic, if Ukrainians are responsible for the civilian deaths because they shot at invading Russian soldiers, then the Iraqis are responsible for the civilian deaths because they shot at invading American soldiers. If Russia is justified in carpet-bombing Ukrainians because they fought back, then America was justified in carpet-bombing Iraqis because they also fought back. And no, I don't support the invasion of Iraq, but if you're going to blame the Ukrainians for shooting at their occupiers, bring that same energy for the Palestinians and the Iraqis.
Договоров о дружбе и взаимопомощи с Донецкой Народной Республикой и Луганской Народной Республикой мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении...
In 2021, around 25 civilians were killed. Then Putin said he had to invade Ukraine to prevent more people in Donetsk and Luhansk from dying. Then, around 1,500 civilians died in Donetsk and Luhansk during the first 2 months of his invasion. This is completely counterproductive. If you honestly believe that Putin invaded Ukraine to save lives in Donbass, then the Russian army has to be the most drunk and incompetent people on the face of the earth, because they accomplished the exact opposite of what they set out to achieve.
Ну, естественно, все слегка податые, да, мягко сказано. И когда мне говорят, вы представляете, они же приехали пьяные. Я говорю, слушайте, я вас умоляю. Я видел, как первую чечню набирали, во вторую, как мы запасников даже призывали на сборы. Ну, партизан простонародье. Я вообще там никогда в жизни трезвых не видел. Ну, это правда, так у нас в стране всегда было.
I don't know if the recent Pentagon leaks are legit, but Kremlin propagandists are claiming that they are. So for argument's sake, let's go by those numbers. Up to 43,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in action as of early 2023. Putin's reason for the invasion was to protect people in Donbass. So he allowed 43,000 of his soldiers to die in order to prevent another 25 civilians from dying in 2022. No sober government would ever do that. Even if the actual amount of dead Russian soldiers was only 10,000, no government would sacrifice 10,000 of their soldiers in a war to prevent another 25 civilians from dying. A government would allow tens of thousands of their soldiers to die in exchange for expanding their borders. And clearly, that's what Putin is doing with what is already the largest country in the world. Protecting people from genocide is an excuse that the Kremlin invokes to justify helping its separatists in other countries.
Accusations of genocide were voiced by the Russian media. During the war, the Russia Today channel was broadcasting with a large caption saying genocide. The same accusation was made by the then former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev.
Народ Южной Осетии пережил геноцид. И так и нужно об этом говорить.
In 2008, the Russian government claimed that Georgian forces were genociding Ossetians, but to this day, they still have not provided evidence of their claims. In 2022, the Russian government claimed that Ukrainian forces were genociding Russians, but they still have not provided evidence of their claims. The Russian government and its media lied about genocide twice to justify military interventions in Georgia and Ukraine. Imagine if the US government and the mainstream media lied about weapons of mass destruction twice to justify military interventions in Iraq and another country. That's how crazy this is. While the Russian government accused Georgia of committing genocide, Georgians, on the other hand, accused Russian forces of allowing them to be driven from their homes while it was under Russian military occupation. Fast forward to today. We know that the Russian government is lying about Ukraine genociding ethnic Russians, and Ukrainians are actually accusing Russian forces of driving them out of their homes. They claimed that a referendum wouldn't be fair because people with pro-Ukrainian views had to leave the occupied areas for their own safety. Are they lying? Well, Igor Mangashev, founder of the Russian private military company Enot Corp, which has been fighting in Donbass, claimed that they were killing people who believed in the idea of a Ukraine and that they wanted to return the Russian lands. Also, if you look at the land that Russia separatists took from Ukraine, it's impossible to take that much land from someone else peacefully. Saying they took that land peacefully is as stupid as saying Israelis took land peacefully from the Palestinians. There are going to be people who oppose what you're doing, and anyone who tries to prevent you from stealing that land has to be removed from the equation. They either have to be driven out of the area, arrested, or killed. Here are excerpts from an August 2014 Human Rights Watch article titled, Ukraine, rebel forces detain, torture civilians.
Beginning in April 2014, armed fighters supporting the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic have captured hundreds of civilians, targeting presumed critics, including journalists, pro-Ukrainian political activists, religious activists, and in some cases, their family members.
Is this fake news? While Russia separatists were in fact abducting and blindfolding journalists because they wanted to hide exactly what was going on.
On Monday, I'd gone to a press conference in the morning outside of the Ukrainian Security Services building, which has been now taken over by the pro-Russia separatists. And they wheeled out a Ukrainian activist slash journalist called Irma, who was let out and blindfolded, and then the blindfold was taken off her and she gave an interview to a bunch of journalists.
Human Rights Watch is also concerned by evidence of extrajudicial executions and other civilian deaths in custody. For example, Human Rights Watch came into possession of 3 death sentences against civilians apparently issued by the Sloviansk Insurgents Summary War Tribunal. 2 were marked executed. Human Rights Watch could not establish the exact number of civilian captives insurgents have held in eastern Ukraine since April. But July 15 report by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights cited a Ukrainian Interior Ministry figure of 717 people, including civilians and members of Ukrainian forces, abducted by armed groups in eastern Ukraine between mid-April and mid-July.
If you're skeptical about this, remember, separatists and the invaders aiding them cannot take land peacefully. there are going to be men who oppose what they are doing and try to stop it. At the very least, those men have to be imprisoned so they don't interfere with the takeover. Hugh Williamson, Europe and Central Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, said,
Self-proclaimed authorities in eastern Ukraine should immediately free anyone held arbitrarily, put an end to arbitrary detentions, extrajudicial killings, hostage-taking, and torture of detainees, and treat anyone in custody, civilians and military alike, humanely and with dignity. Russia should use its influence with insurgent forces in eastern Ukraine to stop these blatant violations and ensure that those responsible are brought to justice.
On April 21, 2014, Vice reporter Simon Ostrovsky was abducted by Russia's separatists in Sloviansk. They held him for 3 days. He claimed that they kept him blindfolded and beat him repeatedly. I don't recall Azov abducting and blindfolding Ostrovsky when he interviewed them. They told him what they were doing, what they were about, and they didn't try to hide it. As per Human Rights Watch, it doesn't just criticize the Russian authorities, it also criticizes the Ukrainian authorities. It's basically a left-wing social justice-driven organization. It criticizes Israel regularly, but when it says something that Vatniks don't like, then they'll call it an extension of US neo-colonialist power and the CIA. I could be wrong, but I don't believe that the current CIA would make an effort to criticize Israel regularly. Not all, but there are a lot of Jews living in the West who feel loyal towards Israel and will help fight for its aims in the Middle East. Not all, but there are a lot of Russians living in eastern Ukraine who feel loyal towards Russia and will help fight for its aims in Europe. That is only one part of Russia's separatist army. In the first 6 months of the war, over 35,000 foreign Antifa volunteers entered the Donetsk People's Republic to join Russia's separatist army. Some of them were recruited by Johan Bachmann, chairman of the Finnish Anti-Fascist Committee. He served as the Northern Europe representative for the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies, where he worked with some of the highest levels of Russian intelligence. Nikol Fradkov, the head of the RISS, was appointed by Putin himself. Fradkov was previously director of the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. Leonid Reshetnikov, who headed the RISS before Fradkov, was a lieutenant general of the SVR. In a January 2017 meeting, Reshetnikov said to Putin,
Mr. President, thank you very much for the attention you have given to the Institute. I would like to say that we did our best for nearly 8 years to implement your foreign policy concept. The policy of Russia and the policy of the President of Russia have been the cornerstone of our operation.
Fradkov, who was also in that meeting, said to Putin,
I am taking over a very good agency from Mr. Reshetnikov, an agency that has won high prestige and has implemented important projects. We are ready to work to fulfill the tasks you set for us. Frankly speaking, these are difficult tasks, but we can fulfill them with your support. I hope that we will continue to receive material, financial, and moral support from you. We are ready to work hard.
When Arnold Mary, head of the Estonian Anti-Fascist Committee, died, Dmitry Medvedev, president of Russia at the time, awarded him the Medal of Honor. Some of the highest levels of Antifa are working with Russian intelligence. There are multiple Russian private military companies fighting in Ukraine, but the Wagner Group, which is playing a major role in the war today, has been involved in the conflict since 2014. They are funded by the Kremlin, and Putin admitted that they received $1 billion this past year in maintenance and incentive payments alone. The Ukrainian government never made it illegal to speak Russian, as Vatniks claim, and I don't believe that Antifa and Wagner are fighting to liberate ethnic Russians from Russian neo-Nazis who are supposedly ethnically cleansing other Russian people. The Kremlin's propaganda does not make sense. Clearly, they are fighting for Putin's geopolitical objectives. While Vatniks and alt media are telling you that Russian troops had to go into Donbass to save Russians, Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner Group, has recently stated that that narrative is a lie and his troops did not go into Donbass to save Russians.
Теперь по тому, почему началась спецоперация. Украинцы имели группировку, которая находилась по границам с территории Донбасса, как раз ту, которую мы проламывали от Попасной до Артемовска. Эта группировка состояла из различных добровольных, скажем так, националистических формирований, а также состояла из действующей армии ВСУ. Эта группировка обменивалась выстрелами. Мы били по ним, они били по нам. И это происходило все эти долгие 8 лет, с 14 по 22. Иногда нарастало количество различных перестрелок, грубо говоря, обмена боеприпасами, обменом выстрелами, иногда уменьшалось. На 24 февраля ничего сверхординарного не было. Сейчас уже Министерство обороны пытается обмануть общественность, пытается обмануть президента и рассказать историю о том, что со стороны Украины была безумная агрессия. И они собирались вместе со всем блоком НАТО на нас напасть. Поэтому спецоперация, так называемая 24 февраля, она была начата совершенно по другим.
The Ukrainians are the one who will suffer most from this entire campaign from the West.
Oh, absolutely. Except for Donbass. I mean, they're being liberated, but
Zion Fraudson often portrays it as if everyone in Donbass wanted to be part of Russia. The separatists took that land peacefully, and the Ukrainian government is attacking them for no legitimate reason. So Putin is not actually invading Ukraine. He is there to liberate it. That is no different than Soviet propaganda, claiming that Stalin didn't actually invade Poland. He was there to liberate it. Now, let's take a look at Ella Polyakova, a member of Russia's Presidential Council for Civil Society and Human Rights. After more than 100 Russian troops died in Ukraine on August 13, 2014, she called out the Kremlin.
When masses of people under commanders' orders on tanks, APCs, and with the use of heavy weapons on the territory of another country cross the border, I consider this an invasion.
Russia's UN ambassador, Vitaly Churkin, was questioned about Russian soldiers in Ukraine, and he said that they were there voluntarily. Most people don't understand how multiple tanks could exit one country's border and then go into another country voluntarily without the government's approval. Alexander Zakharenko, Prime Minister of the DPR, publicly said that Russia gave them 150 armored vehicles, 30 tanks, and 1,200 fighters trained in Russia. If NATO tanks and soldiers crossed Russia's border and began fighting on its territory, all you motherfuckers would be calling it a NATO invasion of Russia. Also, Putin publicly admitted that he sent unmarked Russian troops into Crimea before any referendum was held. Those little green men who took Crimea by force were unmarked Russian troops. So I don't see why Putin wouldn't also send unmarked troops into Donbass. Russia has been invading and waging a proxy war against Ukraine since 2014. But all over alt media, Fatmix will tell you the opposite and paint Putin as the victim. Kremlin propagandists keep repeating the lie that the war could have been avoided if Ukraine was neutral towards Russia. Ukraine was neutral and Russia still invaded them anyway, which is why on December 23, 2014, the Ukrainian parliament voted to scrap their non-aligned status and announced their intention of seeking NATO protection. Also, what European country wouldn't ask NATO for help after they were invaded by Russia? Vatniks believe that because Ukraine asked NATO for help after it was first invaded, now Putin has the right to invade the rest of Ukraine and kill whoever he wants. Imagine if a woman was raped, then she called the police and asked for help. Then her controlling psychopathic ex-boyfriend says, "Well, now I have no choice but to kill you." That's essentially what Putin is doing here.
And what the United States is interested in doing, and the Europeans as well, is toppling regimes in places like Ukraine that are pro-Russian and putting in their place regimes that are basically pro-Western and anti-Russian. And this is exactly what happened on February 22nd, 2014.
We have pushed very hard to encourage the Ukrainians to want to become part of NATO. We have pushed very hard to make them part of NATO.
Mearsheimer claims that the U.S. orchestrated a coup to install an anti-Russian regime and make Ukraine part of NATO. His conspiracy theory doesn't hold weight because even on the day Putin annexed Crimea, Yats announced that Ukraine would not be joining NATO. If Nuland and the CIA orchestrated a coup to install Yats and bring Ukraine inside NATO, as Vatniks often claim, why would Yats oppose NATO membership? It wasn't until 5 months later, when Ukraine felt that they were invaded by Russia in Donbass, that they began the process to drop their non-aligned status.
Which is why anytime a country takes away their nukes, they get invaded.
At the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, Ukraine committed to being a non-nuclear weapons state in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, who promised to respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and borders. Putin violated that agreement by invading Crimea and then helping separatists steal Donbass. Putin does not honor security agreements, yet all over alt media there are idiots blaming Ukraine for not trusting a security agreement with Russia. Also, there never was a signed agreement for NATO not to expand east towards Russia. Rather the opposite.
I've been working on NATO-Ukraine relations for a very long time. I worked in NATO headquarters as what was called a NATO-Ukraine officer. And NATO always had this very ambivalent attitude towards Ukraine. Is that, well, we can't really accept Ukraine in NATO because that will annoy the Russians, but we have to help Ukraine because Ukraine wants to be part of the West. So what do? There's been a lot of sitting on the fence.
When Mearsheimer said that we pushed very hard to make Ukraine part of NATO, he's lying. In just 1 year after Putin's full-scale invasion, Finland became part of NATO. In 9 years, Ukraine is still not part of NATO. If NATO was hell-bent on provoking Russia, as Vatniks often claim, Ukraine would have gotten the treatment that Finland did, but it didn't. People don't realize that a lot of the stuff they're seeing in the pro-Russia sphere of alt media and social media is not based in reality. But because those lies have been repeated in their communities so often, they eventually assume that it must be true. Nowadays, so many people are regurgitating Kremlin propaganda without even realizing it. There's so much more I can say about NATO and Russia, but there's not enough time in these first 2 videos. That and other topics will have to be discussed in the future. After hearing me talk about Russia's proxies in Ukraine, I'm sure some of you are thinking, what about America's proxies in Syria? I'm against Obama's administration arming rebels to fight against the Syrian government, and I'm against Putin arming rebels to fight against the Ukrainian government. Yes, in 2013, Obama did use the CIA to arm rebels fighting against Bashar al-Assad, but some of those rebels were fighting alongside al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda affiliate, and American weapons made its way into their hands. It was a shit show, and then the passionate Zionist Mike Pompeo got Trump to put an end to arming the rebels once he got into office. Obama arming rebels against Assad was actually beneficial to Putin. Obama pushed Assad into Putin's arms. After Assad allowed the Russian military intervention, Russia essentially controls Syria militarily, and this has made Russia and Israel even closer than they already were. Israel relies on Russia for its security, and Russia is not helping Israel for free. What is it getting in return? Is it getting codes for US technology this time? I can't help but wonder. After Assad allowed Russia's military intervention, the Kremlin propagandists and alt media began celebrating him as this democratically elected leader who was supported by the vast majority of his country, and claimed that the CIA was paying all those people to aid him. Before the intervention, they told you how they really felt about Assad, and it was quite the contrast.
Who were just openly apologetic of the Assad regime, if not cheerleading Assad as this kind of subaltern freedom fighter, leading what she called a frontline resisting state, or Sharmin Narwani, the blogger who was nickel and diming civilian casualty counts, who was blaming the victims of the Assad regime, and who was attacking the International Press Corps for attempting to gain access to the scene of the Assad regime's crimes, which reminded me of the Israeli government during Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, when they banned reporters from Gaza. This just was really too much for me.
Before Russia's intervention, Max Blumenthal claimed that Assad was killing civilians without regard, and he agreed with Obama's request for regime change in Syria. After Russia's intervention, he now refers to Assad killing civilians as a regime change scam and propaganda. Was he lying then, or is he lying now? Well, we know for a fact he's lying now about Ukraine. I'm sure some people are thinking that maybe he just changed his views over time. I certainly have on many issues, but I don't believe that's what he's doing here, because him and multiple other Kremlin propagandists did a 180 on Assad at the same time.
Right, but instead, like, everybody is painted in this with this brush of like, oh, it's like they're all Al Qaeda, which is so weird, right? To hear from the left, to hear from people from the left be like they're all Al Qaeda, so like, you know, let's dismiss them. It's very right wing rhetoric that surprises me as well.
It really does. But Assad was a collaborator with Bush in the war on terror. Assad actually tortured people for Bush. And now he's using this very Bush language where he's saying, I'm fighting a war on terror, and the left is buying it.
That's one thing that's amazing is the left. I think that's another thing is we tend to look at these leaders like Assad as, because America didn't like them very strongly at certain points, we see them as these anti-imperialists that they're not. And somehow that's like supposed to excuse everything. And like you said, he wasn't an anti-imperialist, never really has been. And even if he were, it doesn't excuse what he's doing right now.
Before Russia's intervention, Rania Khalek criticized people for dismissing all of the Syrian rebels as Al-Qaeda or terrorists. After Russia's intervention, she has adopted this very Bush-like rhetoric and now claims that moderate rebels do not exist in Syria. What a sellout. And these are the people pushing the narrative that the West backed Putin into a corner and gave him no choice but to do what he's doing today.
But here we see Russian soldiers adhering to international law, to Geneva Convention, treating these Azov Brigade soldiers and Ukrainian forces with medical treatment, taking them to hospital, treating them with the respect and dignity that was not given to Russian POWs. And the fact that Western media is ignoring the difference in the behavior of both sides is indicative of their hypocrisy and actually their criminal support of criminals. And again, this is something that we've seen in Syria for the last 11 years. And they cannot admit that the Russian forces that they have portrayed as the brutal invaders are the ones behaving with decency and humanity. They are weaponizing the extremist, fanatical, ultra-nationalist brigades to effectively, even before the special operation began, to encircle Russia and to threaten Russia itself, to threaten Russia's national security. This is a group that has, for a long time, been persuaded to consider Russian speakers as the Untermenschen, the unspeakables, and to effectively ethnically cleanse them, as we saw in Donetsk and Luhansk.
Regarding the Syrian war, one of the most common talking points you'll hear is that the Western media lies, so you can't trust anything they say about Assad. Vanessa Beeley, an international observer for Russia's sham referendums held after the invasion, has lied over and over again about Ukraine. How do we know she's not lying when she claims that Assad is supported by the vast majority of people in Syria? The highest levels of Kremlin propaganda want to screw up your perception of reality to such an extent that you honestly don't know what to believe.
But in Russia, there was a group of men who had seen how this very lack of belief in politics and dark uncertainty about the future could work to their advantage. What they had done was turn politics into a strange theatre, where nobody knew what was true or what was fake any longer. They were called political technologists, and they were the key figures behind President Putin. They had kept him in power, unchallenged, for 15 years. He was called Vladislav Surkov. Surkov came originally from the theatre world, and those who have studied his career say that what he did was take avant-garde ideas from the theatre and bring them into the heart of politics. Surkov's aim was not just to manipulate people, but to go deeper and play with and undermine their very perception of the world, so they are never sure what is really happening.
I'm not claiming that Assad deliberately used chemical weapons on civilians, but the more he was accused of using them, the harder the West would crack down on him. The harder the West would crack down on him, the more he would have to turn to Russia for help. And I'm not claiming that Russia did some of the chemical weapon attacks in Syria. It's just food for thought. The Ukrainian leaders and Assad are both going to take back the land that was taken over by rebel forces. The world expects them to do that, but while minimizing civilian casualties. Around 3,000 civilians died in almost 8 years while Ukrainian leaders were trying to take back their land. People all over alt media will call this genocide. According to the most conservative estimates available, around 160,000 civilians died in almost 11 years while Assad was trying to take back his land. Yet some of those same people will celebrate him. And I'm not blaming Assad for all those deaths, but clearly, who's more reckless when it comes to shelling targets in residential areas, the Ukrainian leaders or Assad? In the 3 years Zelensky was trying to take back land, around 78 civilians died. People all over alt media called him genocidal and claimed that Russia's military intervention is justified to save lives. But when around 63,000 civilians died in the first 3 years Assad was trying to take back land, those same people claimed that the US had no grounds for military intervention. And I don't support US military intervention in Syria. But if you think that around 63,000 dead civilians was a bullshit excuse used by the US government, how is the Russian government's pretext not even more of a bullshit excuse? Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers and civilians combined have died in this military intervention which Gage supports. Yet he's not calling for Russia to leave Ukraine. A lot of people in alt media are not true anti-war, anti-interventionists as they portray themselves to be. They're all of a sudden pro-war and pro-intervention when it suits the Kremlin's interests. Why is that? All over alt media, Assad is portrayed as this kind of subaltern freedom fighter. And regarding the Syrian war, the most common talking point you'll hear is that Putin and Assad are fighting ISIS. Zion Fraudson would repeat this over and over again. And because of Israel's cooperation with ISIS, a lot of people online would then mistakenly believe that Putin and Assad were fighting against Israel. The US, Kurds, and other rebel groups are also fighting against ISIS. Does that mean the US, Kurds, and other rebel groups are also fighting against Israel? It's a shit show, and because Putin and Assad fighting ISIS gets repeated in alt media over and over again, we, including myself in the past, have overlooked the fact that the US is also bombing ISIS.
مخابرات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي الموساد الأسبق أفريم هالفي أن بشار الأسد هو رجل إسرائيل الأول في سوريا، لذلك فإن تل أبيب لن تسمح بسقوط نظامه الآن. وقال هالفي بحسب مجلة فورن أفريز الأمريكية أن إسرائيل غير مهتمة الآن بإسقاط بشار الأسد، وذلك لأنه سار على نهج والده ولم يقم بأي عمل عدائي ضد إسرائيل طوال 40 عاما، وحافظ على جبهة الجولان بدون قتال، مؤكدا أن هناك مخاوف قوية لدى بلاده من مرحلة ما بعد الأسد.
The war in Syria was never an Israeli intelligence plot for regime change in Syria. If it truly was, Assad would be dead, just like Saddam. Bibi even said himself that he has no problem with Assad staying in power.
We had no problem with the Assad government. For 40 years, not a single missile was fired in the Golan Heights.
Bibi and former head of the Mossad, Ephraim Halavi, have the same view on Assad. Israel and Syria are not friendly towards each other, but Israel likes that Assad has never been a threat to them, hence why they're not trying to remove him from power like they did with Saddam. Bibi wants Iran's proxies pushed away from Israel's borders, which is what Putin is doing.
It's ridiculous, and they're doing the same stuff, saying, oh, Russia's secretly on Israel's side. And they're like, really? That makes a lot of sense, because Syria wouldn't exist without Russia right now.
Zion Fraudson claims that because Putin is saving Assad, that somehow means he must be against Israel. As we went into earlier, Israel is not against Assad. Also, Russia is not secretly on Israel's side. Russia is openly on Israel's side. In 2019, Russia's deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, said that the security of Israel is one of the top priorities of Russia. Putin is protecting Israel in Syria. Fast forward to present day. Israel still wants Russia in Syria because if Russia pulled out, Iran would then increase its influence in the region. So how can Putin be saving Syria from Zog when Israel wants Russia in Syria? Another thing that makes this seem like a Zionist war against Assad is every time Israel bombs Iran's proxies in Syria, Vatniks will say, look, Israel's bombing Syria again. Yes, because Putin has been allowing Israeli pilots to bypass the S-300 and S-400. If you're truly upset about Israel bombing in Syria and want it to stop, then you should condemn Putin instead of shilling for him.
We have pushed very hard to make them a Western bulwark on Russia's borders, despite the fact the Russians made it clear that this was unacceptable to them. We, in effect, and here I'm talking about the West, we took a stick and we poked the bear in the eye. And as you all know, if you take a stick and you poke a bear in the eye, that bear is probably not going to smile and laugh at what you're doing. That bear is probably going to fight back. And that's exactly what's happening here.
On to our next myth. Has the US been trying to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border and wage a proxy war against it since 2014?
I'm your karma closing in with each stroke of a pen. Perfect time to have some remorse to show for your sin. Nope, it's hopeless. I'm the denial that you're hopelessly in. When they say all of this is approaching its end, but you refuse to believe that it's over. Here we go all over again. Backs to the wall, I'm stacking up all the mods. Toilets clogged, yeah, cause I'm talking a lot of shit, but I'm backing it all up. But in my head, there's a voice in the back and it hollers after the track is demolished. I am your lack of a conscience.
Vatniks often claim that the US has been using Ukraine to wage a proxy war against Russia since 2014. That is an outright lie. Obama refused to arm Ukraine at all, and it got to the point where Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said, one cannot win the war with blankets.
Blankets, night vision goggles are also important, but one cannot win the war with the blankets. Even more, we cannot keep the peace with a blanket.
How is America using Ukrainians as cannon fodder in a proxy war when first of all they're the ones asking for weapons, and second, Obama responded by giving them blankets? How the hell do you fight a proxy war with blankets? That's impossible. but Vatniks have repeated a lie so much that now a lot of people just assume that it's true. This is similar to how the left-wing mainstream media lied, saying that vaccinated people can transmit COVID and only unvaccinated people can. Because they've repeated that lie so much, a lot of people assumed it to be true. If Biden, Obama, and Hillary orchestrated a coup in Ukraine to wage a proxy war against Russia, as Vatniks often claim, why would they refuse to provide Ukraine with lethal aid? That defeats the entire purpose. Yes, Obama's administration armed rebels to fight against Assad, but they refused to even sell lethal weapons to Ukraine because they did not want to escalate tensions with Russia. They began training Ukrainian forces because they had an obligation to help them, but they would not provide lethal aid. Obama's administration pursued a reset in relations with Russia.
Indeed, I firmly believe that America's most significant national security interests and priorities could be advanced most effectively through cooperation, not an adversarial relationship with Russia. That's why I committed to resetting the relationship between our two nations.
I wanted to present you with a little gift which represents what President Obama and Vice President Biden and I have been saying, and that is we want to reset our relationship. And
let's do it together.
So we will do it together, okay?
Nuala may hate Russia now, but when she said fuck the EU and wanted Yanukovych to remain in charge for the sake of ending the crisis, she was in Obama's administration, which was pro-Russia at the time. In 2016, Hillary called Trump a Putin puppet to make him look bad when she was running against him. But that doesn't mean she always hated Russia. When she headed the State Department, she allowed Rosatom, a Russian state-owned nuclear energy company, to acquire a controlling stake in Uranium One, which controls 1/5 of all uranium production capacity in the U.S. Hillary and Bill Clinton took millions of dollars combined in donations from Uranium One's chairman and a Russian investment bank while this was all going down. This happened while Obama's administration was seeking to reset relations with Russia. So why would they orchestrate a coup to provoke Russia, just after letting them acquire 20% of all uranium production capacity in the U.S.? The Democrats focusing on Trump's ties to Russian businessmen takes attention away from their past shady business deals and failures with Russia.
Look, Putin, from everything I see, has no respect for this person.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
And it's pretty clear.
You're the puppet.
It's pretty clear.
Trump also refused to provide offensive lethal aid to Ukraine. He sold them Javelin anti-tank missiles, but under the rules of the sale, they had to be stored in western Ukraine. They could not be used in the conflict zone. Trump wouldn't even let Ukrainians use the Javelins in Donbass against tanks from Russia. For years, America has refrained from sending lethal aid to the conflict zone, while Russia has been sending lethal aid to the conflict zone since 2014. Despite this, the Kremlin's agents in the anti-war movement have convinced so many people that America is the aggressor in this conflict. If the US tried very hard to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders, why would Obama and Trump refuse to provide offensive lethal aid to Ukraine? Obama and Trump both placated Russia, but Vatniks will claim that the West has been poking the bear this entire conflict, so Putin had no choice but to do what he's doing today. Again, these people are essentially Putin's PR team in the West. Trump did not provide offensive lethal aid to Ukraine, but he did tell Putin that he would hit Moscow if Putin moved against Ukraine while he was president. He said all those beautiful golden turrets would be blown up.
Praise them.
Yeah.
They're all saying, oh, he's a nuclear power. It's like they're a friend of him. You know, he was a friend of mine. I got along great with him. I say, Vladimir, if you do it, we're hitting Moscow. I said, we're going to hit Moscow. And he sort of believed me, like 5%, 10%. That's all you need. He never did it during my time, John, you know.
No.
They're all talking about it.
No, it's
Why
funny.
did he do this during the last 4 years? Because he knew he couldn't.
It's funny how she didn't bother you either.
Yeah, no, she didn't bother me. And I told her the same thing. That'll be next. Yeah. You know, that's going to be next. Taiwan will be next. You won't have any computer chips. They'll blow them off the face of the earth.
To Trump's credit, Putin didn't make major moves against Ukraine while he was president. Putin only seems to respect strength, which is why much of the international community has changed the way they deal with him. Biden's policy on Russia now is closer to Trump's policy than it is to that of his former running mate, Obama. In March of 2021, Biden gave Ukraine a defensive lethal aid package, which included 2 armed patrol boats. In 1994, Ukraine committed to becoming a non-nuclear weapon state in exchange for security assurances from the US, UK, and Russia. The US has an obligation to defend Ukraine's territory against the use of force, which is why they are providing Ukraine with defensive lethal aid. Vatniks intentionally will not bring up this agreement. Instead, they will lie and claim that the US is arming Ukraine in order to provoke Russia. They are not blaming Russia for invading Ukraine. They are blaming the US for trying to deter Russia from invading any more of Ukraine. With the Taiwan Relations Act from 1979, the US has an obligation to provide Taiwan with defensive arms and possibly even intervene if China invaded Taiwan. Vatniks intentionally will not bring up this agreement. Instead, they will lie and claim that the US is arming Taiwan in order to provoke China. They are not blaming China for threatening to invade Taiwan. They are blaming the US for trying to deter China from invading Taiwan. Also, Biden's administration does not care if China gains control over Taiwan. They prefer that China does it peacefully and through the political system. If China did it by war, that would destroy world trade. In April of 2021, Russia began constructing new bases close to Ukraine's border and allegedly amassed around 80 to 100,000 troops. Biden's administration then prepared a package which included offensive lethal aid to Ukraine. Russia announced it would draw down the troops, and Biden's National Security Council froze the package leading up to the Putin-Biden summit in June. Like Obama and Trump, Biden also placated Russia. Putin praised the summit result and called Biden a tough negotiator. He also claimed that the Russian and US media are wrong when they portray Biden as a demented old man.
This image of President Biden, which is being shown by Russian and US media, doesn't correspond to reality.
Ничего общего не имеет с действительностью. Организаторам данного курса хотел бы сказать большое спасибо и спикерам, и экспертам. Образ, который рисует, он даже...
This image of him can feel discouraging, but there is no need to be discouraged because President Biden is a professional.
Sanctions aside, Trump and Biden would not stop Putin from occupying Crimea. But if he officially took any more of Ukraine, that would be their red line, and America would get involved, which is what we are seeing today. Biden allowed the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, to ship American-made lethal weapons to Ukraine, 1 month before Putin's full-scale invasion, as he was building up on Ukraine's borders. If America truly was trying to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's borders, they would have allowed these weapons to be sent years prior. They wouldn't wait until 1 month before the full-scale invasion. That's retarded. Per GDP, Poland and the Baltic states are giving the most military aid to Ukraine. They are fearful of Russia because of their history with the Russian Empire and the brutal occupation during the Soviet Union. They do not believe that the Kremlin has changed its imperialistic behavior. And I can't blame them for thinking that, because Russian government officials will not stop threatening them. You remember what denazification means, right? A lot of the alt media is very conspiracy theory driven. A lot of people online believe that almost everything has to be a conspiracy. They think that Putin is actually a great guy who would never invade any of his neighbors, and Jews have to be paying them to be fearful of Russia. For Russia, denazification means eliminating a nation which wants to be independent of Russian influence. Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president and current deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, wrote on Twitter that Poland should not exist as long as no one but Russophobes is in power there. Again, the highest levels of the Russian government are Muscovy. They have this imperialistic view demanding subservience from neighboring countries. It's not just the Ukrainians who have a problem with this.
Idźmy, bijmy Moskali, świat nas za to pochwali. Walczmy za swą krainę, pędźmy licho za dźwinę. Idźmy, bijmy Moskali, świat nas za to pochwali.
As Putin was building up on Ukraine's borders, the Kremlin propagandists said he would never invade Ukraine, and the mainstream media lies whenever it comes to Russia, so dismiss everything that they say. It's all war propaganda. How'd that work out?
Folks, the U.S. Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister just had a meeting, trying to resolve some of this tension. And just a few hours later, we hear that the USA is sending military helicopters to Ukraine. You got Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they're sending anti-tank missiles. Everyone is pouring all kinds of weapons into Ukraine. You don't stop war, you don't bring peace by pouring weapons into countries. This insane rhetoric has got to stop. This is insanity. This is just complete and utter insanity. Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. You know how many times they have to say that they don't want a war. They don't want to invade Ukraine.
Russia does not want to invade Ukraine. Russia is not going to invade Ukraine.
Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine. Don't fucking act like Russia's the aggressor here, because they're not.
We haven't been incorrect about anything we've said surrounding Russia and Ukraine this entire time.
After the full-scale invasion, at least 40 countries are giving aid to the Ukrainians as they defend themselves against Russian aggression. If you think that all those countries are doing that because they want to wage a proxy war against Russia, you're free to believe that. But Iran and other Muslim countries are giving aid to the Palestinians as they defend themselves against Israeli aggression. Does that mean that they are waging a proxy war against Israel? I don't believe that the U.S. strategy in Ukraine is a proxy war for regime change in Russia. The U.S. has an obligation to defend Ukraine's territory against the use of force. Also, our European allies don't want Russia taking any more of Europe. Some of them are more aggressive in this war than Biden's administration. They are sending their F-16s while Biden is not. Putin has shown that he will take advantage of weak leaders, which is why countries believe that they have to respond to him with military force. Yes, Lindsey Graham did say that the Ukrainians would fight to the last person. But if Biden's strategy was a proxy war against Russia, why did his administration try to get China to convince Russia to pull back its troops building up on Ukraine before the start of the invasion? Remember, Biden halted the lethal aid package to Ukraine in 2021 after Russia announced it would draw down troops. That could happen again if Russia leaves Ukraine. The West wants Putin to leave and is giving him an opportunity to do so.
Way out of the conflict.
Way out of the conflict. The way out of the conflict is for Russia to leave Ukraine. That's the way out of the conflict. Thank you.
Whenever someone says that Russia should lead Ukraine, Vatniks would respond by saying, "Oh, they can't do that because Russians are being ethnically cleansed in Donbass." You now know that that is bullshit. It is no different than Soviet propaganda. Putin won't lead Ukraine because he's a Moscow who believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia and that they cannot live without each other. This is similar to the controlling psychopathic ex-boyfriend who believes that the woman belongs to him and that they cannot live without each other. Exiled Russian nationalist Dmitry Savin said back in 2017,
"Both the Crimean annexation and then the war caused by Putin are even more destructive for Russian people than the Ukrainians. Ukraine will come out of this war renewed and united. The blood which was shed will unite the nation and at the same time will further separate it from Russia. However, the Russians will turn out to be cut off from both, from Europe and from Ukraine. Russia's economics, medicine, social sphere, everything will turn into ruins due to the insane ambitions of the criminal and incompetent authorities. I think that only Russophobes or idiots can be happy to see that."
As I've shown, Ukraine was not a Western bulwark against Russia prior to the full-scale invasion. Thanks to Putin's insane ambitions and incompetent authorities, it is now.
Спецоперация – это перевод Украины в наше пророссийское лоно. Если мы делаем пророссийское лоно, надо поменять верхушку власти, расцеловать народ в задницу. Мы что сделали? Мы пришли по-хамски, прошлись с сапогами по всей территории в поисках нацистов. Пока искали нацистов, наколбасили всех, кого можем, подошли к Киеву, обосрались и отошли. Мы сделали Украину нацией, которая известна всем во всем мире, что касается демилитаризации. У них было на начало спецоперации 500 танков, у них 5000 танков. Воевать умело 20 тысяч человек, и теперь умеет воевать 400 тысяч человек. Как же мы ее демилитаризировали? Наоборот, мы ее хрен знает как милитаризировали. Украинцы сегодня это одна из сильнейших.
I know I always come and go, but it's out of my control.